The coffee maker beeped twice, same as it did every morning at 6:15. I poured myself a cup, stood at the kitchen window, and watched the neighbor's dog drag his leash across the frost-covered lawn. It was the kind of quiet morning I used to take for granted, back when I still had a wife to share it with. Margaret passed 4 years ago. Breast cancer. We had 38 years together, and I thought I knew what loss was until the morning I woke up, and her side of the bed was cold. And I realized it was always going to be cold from then on. You don't prepare for that. Nobody tells you the grief isn't loud. It's just quiet, morning after morning of quiet. My daughter Carolyn called that afternoon. She was in her late 30s, married to a man named Todd, and they had a boy named Owen who was 7 years old and the best thing in my life since Margaret left it. "Dad," she said, "we're thinking about doing a cabin trip for Thanksgiving." Todd found a place up near Lake Watauga. 4 bedrooms, a dock, the whole thing. I told her it sounded nice. "We want you to come. Owen's been asking about you." That part I believed. Owen and I had a thing going. Every other Saturday I'd pick him up. We'd go to the hardware store when I didn't need anything, then to the diner on Route 9 where he always got the grilled cheese and I got the turkey club. He'd tell me about his teacher and his friends and whatever cartoon he was watching, and I'd listen like it was the most important thing in the world, because for me it was. I said yes to the cabin trip without thinking much about it. I should have thought more. I retired at 63 from 31 years in commercial insurance. I wasn't rich, but I was comfortable. Margaret and I had paid off the house in Knoxville. I had a pension, a decent 401k, and a savings account that I'd been careful with my whole life. We never took lavish vacations. We drove sensible cars. We cooked at home more than we went out. That's just how we were raised. After she died, I updated my will, spoke with my financial advisor, and made sure everything was in order. I had roughly $420,000 in liquid savings. The house was worth another $260,000. I wasn't going to live like a king, but I wasn't going to be a burden either. That mattered to me more than anything. Carolyn knew the rough numbers. I'd been open with her because I thought that's what a good parent did. I wanted her to understand that she and Owen would be taken care of when I was gone. Todd knew the numbers too. I realized later that was a mistake. Todd Hargrove was 41 years old and had never held a job for more than 3 years in a row. He'd done sales, done some kind of online marketing, tried to open a bar with a friend that failed inside of 8 months. He always had a reason for why things hadn't worked out. The economy, a partner who screwed him, bad timing. It was never Todd. Never once in all the years I'd known him was it ever Todd's fault. Carolyn had defended him every single time. That's what love does to a person, I suppose. You build a story about who someone is, and you hold on to that story even when the evidence says otherwise. By the time the cabin trip came around in November, Todd and Carolyn were carrying about $90,000 in credit card debt and a second mortgage on their house in Chattanooga. I knew about the second mortgage because Carolyn had called me crying 6 months earlier, and I had written a check for $22,000 to help cover the balloon payment. That was not the first check. Over the years, in loans I'd stopped expecting back, I had given my daughter and her husband something close to $160,000. I'm not saying that to sound bitter. I'm saying it because it matters to what comes next. The cabin was beautiful. I'll give Todd that he had good taste when someone else was paying. 3 stories, floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over Lake Watauga, a wraparound porch with rocking chairs, a fire pit down by the water. The kind of place you see in a magazine and think, someday. Owen ran straight to the dock the moment we arrived, pointing at the water and asking if there were fish. I told him there were. He asked if we could catch some. I told him we'd try in the morning. That first evening was fine. Carolyn made chili. We sat by the fire. Owen fell asleep on the couch with his head on my knee, and I remember thinking, this is enough. This right here is enough. But I noticed things. Todd and Carolyn whispered a lot, not the normal kind of married couple whispering, the passing logistics back and forth. This was different. They'd go quiet when I walked into a room. Todd would be on his phone and close an app before I could see the screen. I told myself I was being paranoid. Margaret used to say I had a suspicious mind, and she didn't always mean it as a compliment. The second morning, I got up early and made coffee and went out to the porch. Owen must have heard me because 20 minutes later, the sliding door opened and he came out in his pajamas and his knockoff Nikes he wore everywhere, including indoors. He sat in the rocking chair next to mine. We watched the fog move across the water. "Grandpa," he said, "do you like it here?" "I do," I said. "You?" He nodded, but he was picking at the sleeve of his pajama top the way he did when something was on his mind. I'd seen it at the diner. I'd seen it when his hamster died. I knew that look. "Owen," I said, "what's going on?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at the water, and then he looked at his shoes, and then he said, very quietly, "I heard Daddy talking last night." I waited. He was on the phone, and I got up to get water, and the door was open a little. He paused. "He said your name, Grandpa." "What did he say?" Owen scrunched up his face like he was trying to remember exactly. "He said something about the dock, about how it gets slippery in the morning. He said." He stopped. "It's okay," I said. "You can tell me." He said old men fall all the time and nobody asks questions. I heard it. I let the words sit there in the morning air between us for a moment because I wasn't sure I'd understood them correctly. "Are you sure that's what he said?" Owen nodded. His eyes were very serious. 7 years old and looking at me with that seriousness that only children get when they know something is wrong, but don't have the words to explain why. He said it quiet, but I could still hear, Owen said. "I didn't like it, Grandpa. I didn't like how he said it." I reached over and put my hand on top of his, and I told him he did the right thing, telling me. I told him to go back inside and get warm and not say anything to his mom or dad. I told him we'd go fishing later. He looked at me for a long moment. "Are you okay?" "I'm going to be just fine," I said. I sat there for another half hour after he went in. The fog lifted off the water slowly. The dock extended maybe 30 feet out, and yes, in the early morning with the dew on the wood, it would be slippery. A man my age, a fall from the right angle, hitting the edge of the dock or the water at the wrong angle in November when the temperature was 41 degrees. It was not a complicated scenario once you heard it laid out. I thought about my $420,000. I thought about the house. I thought about who the beneficiary was on my life insurance policy. I thought about the fact that I had never changed that policy after Margaret died. The primary was still her. The contingent was Carolyn. $400,000 in life insurance. She would have known that. I went inside and poured my coffee down the drain because my stomach couldn't take it. I did not panic. I want to be clear about that. I am 67 years old. I spent 31 years assessing risk for a living. When you spend that long looking at worst-case scenarios on paper, something happens to you. You stop flinching at them. You just start calculating. I went to my bedroom when I called my attorney, Alan Finch. He'd handled Margaret's estate and he knew my situation. I told him I needed to make some changes that day immediately, and I needed to know if I could do it remotely. He asked if I was all right. I told him I needed to change my life insurance beneficiary to Owen directly through a trust he would establish on my behalf. I told him I wanted my liquid savings moved into that same trust structure with Owen as the sole beneficiary, with Carolyn receiving a monthly stipend only, managed by him, for as long as she and Todd remained married. If they divorced, the arrangement would be revisited. Alan was quiet for a moment. "Gordon," he said, "what happened?" I told him I'd explain fully when I was back in Knoxville. I told him to get started. He did. The second call I made was to my friend Walt from the insurance days, who had a brother-in-law in the Knox County Sheriff's Department. I told Walt I needed a contact number. He gave it to me without asking why. That was the kind of friend Walt was. The third call I almost didn't make. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time, because here is the thing nobody tells you about a moment like this. The hardest part is not the danger. The hardest part is the grief of realizing that your own child, the person you sat up with through fevers and nightmares and heartbreaks, has looked at your life and decided it is worth more to her ended than continued. That is a specific kind of pain. There is no word for it that I have found. I made the third call. I acted normal for the rest of that day. I took Owen fishing. We caught 2 smallmouth bass and threw them both back. He talked the whole time about a video game he wanted and whether his teacher liked him, and I listened to all of it and laughed at the right moments and made sure he felt like everything was ordinary. Because, for him, it needed to be. That evening, Todd suggested we all go for a walk down to the dock to watch the sunset. He was very casual about it. He had a glass of bourbon in his hand, and he'd put his arm around Carolyn's shoulder and said it would be a nice thing to do together. I told him I was tired and my knee had been bothering me. I was going to stay on the porch. Something passed across his face, very fast, like a card being flipped over and then flipped back. He said, "Sure, no problem." And then the 3 of them went down toward the water, and I watched from the porch, and I kept my eyes on Owen the entire time. They were down there 20 minutes. Nothing happened. When they came back, Todd's mood was different, quieter. He refilled his bourbon and sat at the kitchen island looking at his phone and didn't say much for the rest of the night. Carolyn kept glancing at me. I smiled back each time. I made sure my smile looked the way it always looked. I had not slept in 30 hours. The next morning, my last full day at the cabin, I packed most of my bag before breakfast. I told Carolyn I'd gotten a call from Alan about something with the estate that needed attention, and I was going to head back to Knoxville after lunch. She looked surprised. She said the plan was to stay through Sunday. "I know," I said, "but this is time sensitive. You and Todd and Owen stay and enjoy it. Don't cut the trip short on my account." Todd was watching me from across the kitchen. He had a look I'd never seen on him before. Assessing. Measuring. I gave him nothing. After breakfast, I got Owen alone in the room we was sharing. I told him we were going to have lunch together real soon, just the 2 of us. Diner on Route 9, grilled cheese, the whole thing. I told him he was the bravest kid I knew. He said, "Is everything okay, Grandpa?" "For real?" "For real," I said. "You did something important by telling me what you heard. You protected somebody you love. That's what brave people do." He didn't entirely look convinced, but he hugged me hard, the way small kids hug when they mean it with everything they have, and I held on a little longer than I normally would. I drove back to Knoxville on a Tuesday in November with the heat on and a country station playing low. The hills were bare and brown and the sky was the color of old pewter. I stopped at a gas station outside of Elizabethton and sat in the parking lot for a while with the engine running. I kept thinking about when Carolyn was 9 years old and had her tonsils out. She was terrified of the IV, and I sat on the edge of her hospital bed and held her hand and told her a story I made up on the spot about a girl who explored caves and found entire cities underground. She fell asleep before I finished it. I always meant to finish it. I thought about that story a lot in the weeks that followed. Alan had the trust documents ready by Wednesday. I signed them, had them notarized, and the beneficiary changes on the life insurance were processed by Friday. The savings were moved into the trust structure by the following Tuesday. I also had Alan draft a letter to Todd and Carolyn on firm letterhead, informing them of the changes and clarifying that no further direct financial transfers would occur. It was not a cruel letter. Alan wrote it carefully, but it was clear. I also met with Detective Breckenridge, Walt's brother-in-law. I told him everything Owen had told me. I told him about the doc, the exact phrasing as Owen had reported it, and the context. He listened carefully and asked good questions. He explained that without a direct recording or a witness who was over the age of 18, what we had was circumstantial. He said that what I described in legal terms was not yet actionable, but it's documented now, he said. In writing, with me, dated. If anything happens to you or to that boy, this is on record. I understood. I thanked him. He gave me his direct line and told me to call him if anything changed. He also suggested gently that I consult with a family law attorney about the question of Owen's welfare. given what I now believed about his home environment. I made that call too. Carolyn called me 3 days after she got Alan's letter. I let it go to voicemail. She called again. I let that go too. On the fourth call I picked up, she was crying. She said she didn't understand. She said it came out of nowhere. She said Alan's letter had blindsided them and that Todd was furious. I let her talk. When she was done, I said calmly, "Carolyn, I love you. I've loved you since before you were born. But I know what Todd said on that phone call at the cabin." Silence. I know about the doc. I know about what he said about old men and questions. The crying stopped. A 7-year-old heard your husband make that phone call, and that 7-year-old loves me enough to tell me what he heard. I paused. I want you to think about what that means, about who you are married to and what he was willing to do and whether your son is safe in that house. She said nothing for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was very small. "Dad, I'm not angry at you," I said, and I meant it, but I can't pretend I didn't hear what I heard, and I will not be a source of money for a man who considered having me fall off a dock. I told her that Owen was always welcome at my house, anytime. She could bring him or he could come alone if he was old enough. I was not cutting her out of my life. I was cutting Todd out of my finances and out of my trust. And if she chose to stay married to him, I understood. But the financial relationship was over. She hung up. Todd called me himself 2 days later. I almost didn't answer, but I did. He said Owen was a child who'd misheard something. He said he'd been on the phone with a buddy joking around, talking about an old neighbor, and Owen had taken it out of context. His voice was very smooth, practiced. Todd had always been a good talker. "That might be true," I said. "It is true," he said. "Then you won't mind if I stay exactly where I am," I said. "New trust documents, new beneficiaries, no further money. If you're telling the truth, none of that should bother you." Long pause. "This is going to create a lot of problems," he said. "I imagine it will," I said. I hung up. 6 weeks later, Carolyn called me on a Sunday evening. She sounded different. Not crying, not angry, just exhausted in the particular way of someone who has finally stopped fighting something they already knew was true. She said Todd had moved out. She said she'd found things on his phone, conversations with someone she didn't know, financial accounts she hadn't known existed, other things she didn't want to go into. She said she had called a divorce attorney on Monday. She didn't mention the cabin or the dock. Maybe she wasn't ready to. Maybe she'd already reconciled with it in some way I couldn't follow. But she asked if she could bring Owen over on Saturday, if we could all have dinner. I said yes. Owen arrived carrying a drawing he'd made for me at school. It was a picture of 2 people on a dock with fishing poles, both of them catching fish, and the sun in the corner was a big yellow circle with about 15 rays coming off it. Underneath it he'd written, in 7-year-old handwriting, "Me and Grandpa, the good dot." I put it on the refrigerator with a magnet, and I have never taken it down. I still get up at 6:15. I still make coffee and stand at the kitchen window. The neighbor's dog passed away last spring. Old age, his owner told me. And now there's a new puppy who tears across the frost in a completely different direction every morning, like the whole yard is a mystery he hasn't solved yet. I watch him and I drink my coffee and I think about what it cost me to survive that trip to Lake Watauga. Not money. Not even peace of mind, though that took time to come back. What it cost me was the version of my daughter I had believed in. The one I made up, maybe. The same way parents make up versions of their children that are easier to hold on to than the truth. She's not that person, but she's not entirely the other one either. She's just Carolyn, trying to put her life back together. And she brings Owen over on Saturdays now, and sometimes she stays for dinner and sometimes she doesn't. We are finding our way back to something. I don't know yet what to call it. Owen is 8 now. He talks constantly, still, about everything. His teacher, his friends, the puppy next door, whether fish remember being caught. He asks questions I can't answer and accepts that gracefully, which is more than most adults manage. A few weeks ago, he climbed up on the kitchen stool while I was making eggs and he said, "Grandpa, I'm glad you didn't fall." I looked at him. At the cabin, he said, "I'm glad." I turned back to the stove so he wouldn't see my face. "Me too, buddy," I said. "Me too." The eggs sizzled. Outside, the puppy was barking at something in the leaves. The morning was cold and bright and entirely ordinary, and I was in it, and that was everything. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, trying to figure out what it actually means. Not the legal part. Alan handled that. Not the emotional part. That's still ongoing, if I'm honest. I mean the deeper thing underneath it. The thing that explains how a man can spend 67 years trying to do right by the people around him and still end up standing on a porch at 5 in the morning, wondering if his own family had decided his life was worth more as a payout. Here's what I've come to believe. The choices we make, quietly, consistently, over decades, eventually catch up with everyone involved, not as punishment, not as reward, just as consequence. Todd made choices. He made them long before that cabin, long before that phone call Owen overheard. Every time he avoided accountability, every time he took without giving back, every time he looked at another person and calculated their value rather than recognized their worth, those choices shaped him into someone capable of standing at a kitchen island and looking at his father-in-law like a problem to be solved. That didn't happen overnight. It never does. And I made choices too. I told myself I was being generous when I wrote those checks. Maybe I was, partly, but I was also avoiding a harder conversation. I was choosing the short-term peace of not saying no over the long-term integrity of meaning what I said. Every dollar I handed over without condition was me teaching Todd that there were no conditions. I helped build the dynamic I ended up trapped inside. That's not self-blame. That's just honesty about cause and effect. What I keep coming back to is Owen, 8 years old, padding down a hallway in his pajamas for a glass of water, and somehow having the clarity and the courage to tell me what he'd heard. People talk about intelligence like it's something you accumulate over time, like savings. But Owen didn't need 67 years of experience to know that something was wrong. He needed one thing, the integrity to say so even when it was frightening, even when he didn't fully understand what he was reporting, even when the people involved were his own parents. That is a kind of moral intelligence that most adults spend a lifetime failing to develop. It is not complicated. It is just honest. See the truth. Say the truth, even when it costs you something. I think about what would have happened if Owen had stayed in his bed that night, if he'd heard those words and decided it wasn't his place, or that he'd misunderstood, or that telling me would cause some kind of trouble he didn't want to be responsible for. Children make that calculation all the time. We teach them to without meaning to every time we say don't get involved or it's not your business. Owen didn't do that. He got up. He came to the porch. He sat with me in the cold and told me what he knew. That took more courage than anything I did in response. I made phone calls. I signed documents. I had the resources and the experience to protect myself once I knew what to protect myself from. Owen had none of that. He just had the willingness to do the right thing when it mattered. If I could leave anyone watching this with one thought, it's this. Pay attention to the people in your life who are still young enough to tell the truth without calculating the cost. And if you are the older one, the one with the resources, the experience, the position, do not make yourself so comfortable in your own story that you stop listening to the people who love you enough to tell you what you don't want to hear. The dock at Lake Watauga is still there, I assume. I haven't been back. I don't need to. I've got a drawing on my refrigerator of 2 people fishing in the sun, and that's the version of that trip I'm keeping.